Welcome everybody. Really excited to have you here today as we talk about the recent paper that we published on time to FDA authorization for Medicare coverage for novel medical technologies. The plan today is to take you through a two-part agenda. We'll walk through the paper and the paper finding itself, and then we'll have a panel discussion that will be moderated by Kavita Patel, and will include three panelists who will discuss some of the findings and their thoughts. So I'm Sandy Ruggles. I am the Director of Policy Research here at Stanford Biodesign. And I'm joined in discussing the paper by Kevin Schulman, who is one of the senior authors on the study. So let me start by grounding you in biodesign itself. At the Stanford Byers Center for Biodesign, our purpose is to advance health outcomes and equity through innovation, education, translation, and policy. And for this webinar in particular, we wanted to put some disclaimers up around the work. This was work that was not specifically commissioned or paid for by any entity. And the content here does contain our personal opinions and is not endorsed by Stanford University. So every year, thousands of new technologies are authorized by the Food and Drug Administration for commercial availability in the United States. And many of these are focused on and address pressing unmet clinical needs. There's a particular process that new technologies and the manufacturers that support them must traverse following FDA authorization. That product may be commercially available, but the process to have the treatment or the diagnosis that it supports covered by medical insurers requires three key components. And those three key components are coding, payment, and coverage. So here at Stanford Biodesign, we've been interested and focused on studying this path to establishing a new technology following FDA authorization, and that path to establish a new code, a new coverage decision, and a new payment rate when a novel technology is introduced into the market. We started 2 years ago with a survey of innovators and investors about what this process after FDA authorization is like. And their comments from our survey reflected the challenge and the complexity of navigating a three-part system that has multiple important decision makers, including CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, as well as the American Medical Association, and a bevy of commercial insurers. And so when we asked about this process, we surveyed for quantitative data on this process. We heard from these same innovators and investors that the time to these reimbursement milestones following FDA authorization ranged from 2.5 years to 4.7 years to fully establish the code, the appropriate payment, and coverage decisions. Now, remember, these coverage decisions are both being made by Medicare as well as by commercial insurers, and they define which patients and under which conditions the treatment or the diagnosis the technology supports will be covered by the insurer. And I think the thing that struck us the most as a team of researchers was that these bars had such a significant amount of variability. Not only did it take 4.7 years to establish nationwide or national Medicare coverage and commercial insurer in coverage, but those error bars were quite substantial and looked like they stretched from as little as 2 years upwards to 8 years. So that is the nut, the seed for the study that we're going to go through in more detail today. And I'm pleased today to be representing the entire author team on the study. This is Zach, Juliana, Artem, Jan, Meg, Kevin, and myself, as well as Josh. And so in our effort to understand in a more quantitative and analytical way this timeline from FDA authorization to the establishment of coverage, we did two different things to focus this study. First, we chose to study and look at technologies that we purposely curated for those that were more likely to need to establish a new coverage. And those were technologies that were authorized by FDA through the pre-market approval or PMA pathway, those that were authorized through the de novo pathway, and those that came through the breakthrough device designation program and fell under the 510(k) scope of authorization. We did not take on all 510(k) authorizations each year. Instead, we tried to focus on just those that were likely to be requiring this new coverage. And with that, we also took a 4-year cohort between 2016 and 2019, so that we had a good group of technologies that we estimated, based on the survey that we had done previously, would have traversed through many of these coverage milestones in the subsequent time of the study. So if you start with those 281 technologies, you're talking about technologies that span many different types of products, diagnostic devices, implantable devices, devices that support outpatient procedures, inpatient procedures, and as well some of the emerging digital technologies. And so the process here and the flow chart here shows you how we got from those 281 technologies to a cohort of 64 that were analyzed for that timeline to coverage. And that's by excluding those technologies that were not reimbursed through Medicare for one reason or another, as well as excluding those technologies where coverage had already been established prior to FDA authorization. And what you'll see, if you were to look at the data set, you'll see that these technologies span 15 plus different types of review groups within the FDA, and that they also span a wide variety of types of technologies. And so we evaluated them for the time to a coverage milestone. And we defined the coverage milestone a particular way. And that was, we used the term at least nominal coverage. And at least nominal coverage in this study is defined two different ways. It's defined through the establishment of an explicit coverage decision. This is a national coverage decision, a local coverage decision through one of the Medicare administrative contractors, be that a DME MAC or one of the 7 primary MACs, also through a MolDX coverage determination. So that's explicit coverage. And explicit coverage meant that technology had been evaluated by CMS and that there was a published determination. Now, there's an alternate way that technologies may reach at least nominal coverage, and that was through the establishment of implicit coverage. And we defined that through the codes that were used to bill for the technology. This means that a new technology had advanced so far that a HCPCS level 1 or CPT1 code had been assigned to the technology, or that technology had been evaluated by CMS and assigned a HCPCS level 2 code. HCPCS level 2 codes are for products, services, and supplies that fall outside of the CPT-1 codes. We did exclude a couple different types of codes, primarily codes that were temporary. Either they were a temporary code designation or had a temporary payment associated with those. So you see here how we defined coverage, and then we took that cohort of 64 technologies. We applied this set of rules around establishment of coverage. And then we looked at how long it took to reach these coverage milestones. So first off, in the data set, 28 technologies achieved Medicare coverage. That's shown by the orange triangle in the graphic here. Those that did not yet achieve coverage, are still seeking coverage, are shown by a black arrow on the right-hand side. So 44% of technologies achieved a coverage milestone. And that time to a Medicare coverage milestone ranged from 90 days all the way up to over 7 years. And so we see that variability reflect that had been originally uncovered in the survey, reflected here in these time to coverage milestones. So how did these technologies that established coverage, how did they accomplish it? Well, they accomplished it through both these explicit and implicit coverage milestones. It was more likely that an implicit coverage milestone was reached than an explicit coverage milestone or a coverage determination was reached. And that is, so you can see here this, the distribution between the ways that the technologies achieved coverage. Now, if you were to add up the NCDs, the LCDs, all through that middle row there, you'll see that that adds to more than 28. 8 of the technologies established at least nominal coverage through both explicit and implicit coverage milestones. And again, 36 or 56% are still seeking coverage. So I'm going to hand it over to Kevin here to talk about the analysis of the data set and walk you through the Kaplan-Meier curves.
Great, thanks, Sandra. So we have data from 2016 through 2019 in terms of approval, and our data set was, our data were collected at the beginning of 2023. And so there were still even technologies from 2016 that were still waiting for approval. And so this type of data structure suggests right censoring of the data. And so we wanted to account for censoring. And working with Meg Nikolov here, we did a sensor data analysis with these Kaplan-Meier curves to try and understand time to median coverage. And you can see here what that looks like. So median coverage was about 5.7 years. But again, there's still technologies that are waiting for coverage. Next slide. One of the questions, with this analysis, we can then ask questions about things that were related to faster time to coverage. So the first question is, how did clinical evidence help firms achieve coverage? And statistically speaking, unfortunately, the answer is it did not help them achieve coverage. Here's technologies that were accompanied by level 1 evidence, and technologies are not accompanied by level 1 evidence. And what you can see here is that the differences are not statistically significant. As you get out to 5 and 6 years, the number of technologies out there is fairly low. So I wouldn't make too much of the point estimates in that part of the curve, but up till year 4, you can see the curves totally overlap. The next question that we asked was, what kinds of technology achieve coverage sooner? And there were some differences here. Diagnostic assays and technologies for acute treatment received coverage faster. than diagnostic devices or technologies for longer, for chronic treatments. The other question that we asked is, who were the sponsors? Were the sponsors larger firms or smaller firms? And what you can see here is there's actually a real significant difference. If the sponsor was a larger firm, they were more likely to achieve coverage than if they were a smaller firm. Still, when you look at this curve, 80, they're going, even large firms were going 5 years till 80% of their technologies achieve coverage. For small firms, even at the end of 6 years, 50% of firms had not achieved coverage. Or 60% of technologies from small firms had not achieved coverage.
Great. Thanks so much, Kevin. I understand there's some questions in the Q&A, and I'm going to bring those up. This is your moment to ask some questions about the study itself. You can use the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we'll address some of that, some of those. So I think there's one question here in the Q&A, which is, do we think 44% is good, bad, or average? I don't know that we're trying to qualify this one way or the other. I think the intent here was to really take a wide aperture lens that went across many different types of technologies so that we could see exactly what is happening in this post FDA authorization time period. So I'm sure that depending on your perspective around the level of evidence that's necessary to achieve a coverage decision, those numbers may or may not may reflect your point of view in that space. Looks like we have, let's see. Here we go. So we have a couple of additional questions that have been added to the Q&A. Kevin, let's take a look at some of these and see if we can address some of them here before we head into the panel. So we got a question on how many companies worked with legal firms with reimbursement experience. Unfortunately, that's not something we would be able to find from publicly available data sets. And so I can't speculate on whether they were more successful with if they were to have worked with and consulted through legal firms that had reimbursement experience. Let's see. There was a question about the median time to coverage. Maybe Kevin, you want to take this one around the median time to coverage for small firms alone, excluding the large firms.
Yeah, so we didn't, well, 50% of the population didn't get coverage at the end of the observed period for small firms. So, so the time that, I'm not sure how we would analyze it. So we looked at time to median coverage, which would be about 50% of the technologies get coverage. And so that's somewhere in the future beyond 6 years for small firms.
Let's see, there's this great, we have lots of questions in the Q&A, so I really appreciate everyone putting their questions in here. Any indication that the new breakthrough designation for devices has had any positive impact? I think around this question, because we chose a cohort of technologies that run from 2016 to 2019, we had a very small number of products that had been selected for the breakthrough designation program and had reached FDA authorization that fell into this cohort. Too small to be able to analyze as a breakout in any real way. Would love to run this analysis again a couple of years in the future where we have more of those authorizations in place. Kevin, I'm running down through this list. Do you see any here that that you'd like to answer? Some of these I think we can make sure we address in the panel because they are more open-ended.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to take note of, just again, this median time to coverage, these things were found to be reasonable and necessary. It just took an extended amount of time to do that. So it's not that they were not covered, it just was the amount of time it took when these technologies were ready or eventually determined to be reasonable and necessary.
Right, and I think so. There's some good questions here that that we sought to address with the way we did the analysis. There's a question here about whether there are different decision-making criteria at the payer level that may be influencing the difference between the different times to reimbursement. And I would actually say that I believe that the part C of these curves actually clearly demonstrates that depending on the type of technology, the median time to coverage was different, suggesting that, and I think it's probably pretty clear that the demonstration of reasonable and necessary for a diagnostic device is likely to be very different than the demonstration of reasonable and necessary for something that's a chronic or ongoing treatment, like a piece of durable medical equipment or an implantable device that would have fallen into the chronic and ongoing group. Let's see. Okay, so I think we've addressed most of these. I think the remaining questions we can address through typing some answers. Kevin, do you see anything else that you'd like to call out? Or actually, I'll open it up to the rest of the panelists as well. If there's any Q&A on the study itself that you'd like Kevin and I to address before we move to the panel discussion.
No, James Fan had a question about exclusion criteria. So it wasn't that the specific device necessarily had coverage. It just, there was an existing reimbursement category related to that device.
Right. Thanks, Kevin, for clarifying that. Okay, so great. Thank you, everybody, for all of your questions. We'll make sure we get some of the smaller some of these questions addressed through through typing them. And with that, what I'll do is hand this over to Kavita to introduce our panel and to kick off our panel discussion.
Great. Thanks, Sandy. I'm going to just go ahead and ask someone, not me, who's better at Zoom, to try to place out as I introduce folks to kind of switch out the slide with our pictures. And I'll go ahead and do more than like a 30-second intro for people to be able to kind of hear just a little bit. And of course, you all can Google a little dangerously. I'm not reading entire bios of our three panelists just so that I can avoid spending about 20 minutes. So as they come off of as they come onto camera. First up, Dr. Josh McHour, co-founder and director of Biodesign and one of the senior authors of the JAMA study, and an illustrious medical technology background to add into that. And then I'm just going to do it in order of how I have it. So Leslie Trigg, chairperson and CEO of Outset Medical, and she also has a pretty extensive medical technology background along with investing experience and a number of other hats she has worn. And she's not part of the original authorship team. I am not myself, and our next panelist is not, but we wanted to, with the panel, I think there were a lot of questions that talk about the language that's come out of CMS and some of the proposed kind of ideas that have been floating around both commercial and public payers. So we wanted to have probably the best folks who could represent all of those views. And then last but not least is Prashar Patel, no relation to myself, but a great last name either way, CEO and president of Market Access Strategy, LLC, and somebody that has not only worked in the administration, worked with kind of members on the public and private side, but also has a good grasp. I think we're going to have a number of questions that were proposed and when Sandy, when you and Kevin presented, that I think our panelists might answer. So for the sake, I was not worried that we would have a lot of comments and questions, but I did not imagine the onslaught that we would have. So I'm going to try to do a bit of a balancing act. We're going to stick to time. So we have about 32 minutes to try to get to some of these key questions. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it off. And then we're going to ask each of the panelists to address some specific questions. We're going to have then an all panelist response to close, but then we will get to Q&A. And what I'm going to try to do for the sake, and anybody who's raising their hands on the webinar, normally in webinars, we'll have a chance to raise a hand and call out to an individual. I think for the sake of time, if people want to, and you can do it anonymously, put the question in the Q&A, because I'm going to try to lump it by themes, because I see some common themes. In the meantime, Prashar, I want you, if you don't mind, I mentioned a little bit about your background. I want to thank, by the way, all of you for attending. You're doing this with clearly 5,000 other things you could be doing on a Monday, but I know how important this topic is. So you've been in the seat. You did not work on this kind of proposed rule that we didn't really cover because that wasn't the focus of the JAMA article, but it is hanging out there. So I want to just offer on the kind of, have you give us just some background and commentary, even though you did not work on this language, just to talk for anybody who is not familiar, like where that process sits in terms of this TSET proposed rule and kind of what is likely going to happen, what the administration might be doing with some of these comments as they're coming in. And maybe if you don't mind, you are doing a lot of work with the commercial sector. People are having to decide about how to pay for this, whether you're in Medicare or on a commercial plan. I'm not touching Medicaid for now, but you can throw in your comments about that. Just give us an overview of what you're seeing in terms of reimbursement in general. So first, CMS and what you think might be happening in the background based on your prior experience, not any current experience with this TSET proposed language. And then also what's the commercial sector doing?
Yeah, I'll take, thank you, Kavita, and thank you, Josh, and the Stanford team for inviting me here to talk. Just to recap, right, where we were about 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, CMS was going to go ahead with one proposal, MSIT. The new administration comes in and for a whole host of reasons decides that that was not appropriate, repeals that proposal, and then takes almost 2 years to put out what we saw in June, 2.5 years, I guess, what we saw in June. They've, in the meantime, had lots of conversations with many folks on this webinar, lots of companies, stakeholders, patient advocacy groups within the administration, Congress, et cetera. I think what they've put out, and they were very, interestingly, they decided not to put out a regulation because they felt like they could proceed faster with a notice. So I suspect, and we've heard, that there are a number of companies that are interested in piloting this process. So I suspect they're in the process of actually talking to those companies, developing the evidence reviews. Some of them, from what I understand, have already been developed. And they're probably in the process of negotiating what those evidence plans are. And I would expect over the course of the next, again, my guess is as good as anybody else's on this panel, but over the next 2, 3, 4 months, we'll probably hear 1 or 2 of those come to fruition. And I think that'll be the start of an iterative process, right? Nothing is ever set in stone in policy, which is a good thing. And CMS has explicitly said that they're going to learn from this experience. They're going to continue taking feedback from stakeholders and modify the process that they use along the way. So I think that's what we're going to expect to see over the next couple of months. We've already seen a couple documents that begin to point the way for companies. We saw one on knee osteoarthritis of the knee, which was in essence a evidence review of the current state of literature there. I think they're going to be putting out more of those. We saw revised CED guidance and a process guidance. So I think the next big one that I would look out for is guidance on fit for purpose studies. What exactly do they mean by that, right? Because all the words are very nice, but ultimately the proof will be in the pudding. So that's what I expect to see over the next few weeks and months, Kavita.
Great. Do you want to comment on the commercial side?
Yeah,
Anything of note or reactions? I know everything is still kind of unfolding in some ways, but just any curious initial reactions. You know, obviously won't name any payers for specifically, but just overall trends.
Yeah, I mean, I think, historically, private payers generally have not paid for what they view as investigational experimental devices. And when CMS started CED, I think the initial instinct was, well, these are experimental, even though they've received FDA approval. But I think when you take a look at the track record for private payers, at least with those technologies that went through CED, they do generally get on board eventually, whether it's initially or later. And so I think with the TSET process, I'm hoping and anticipating that they will get on board and start covering these technologies once they see, and I think the fact that CMS is going to make the evidence plan public, the evidence review public, and how the company is expecting to address those gaps, hopefully will give them confidence, and should give them confidence, in fact, that the evidence is being generated, but yet the evidence that is out there is good enough for Medicare to actually grant coverage. So hopefully that'll be a good sign. And hopefully private payers will get on board faster than they perhaps did with CED.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much. And I know we'll return to keep in mind there's questions I think that have already been asked that I know you may touch on. So when we get done with kind of our panel questions, we'll get to some of those. Leslie, if we can move, and perhaps maybe you can tell us a little bit, I didn't want to try to characterize Outset Medical technology innovation in my words. I wanted you to use your words. Can you just tell us a little bit, because I think some of the folks in our Q&A have been asking about kind of a small, what I'll call a small company perspective, just with some assumptions I'm interpreting as there's a lot of things that if you're thinking about reimbursement issues, first you're thinking about, technology that actually demonstrates, safety, benefit, et cetera. And of course, you're thinking about the reimbursement, but all of this combined with kind of the level of what we saw in the JAMA article, kind of the level of evidence required adds complexity to, your timeline, I imagine. So tell us a little bit, number one, about your company and how, or any of the other hats you've worn, how these reimbursement issues really do impact, or do they impact decision-making? And then just talking through this average length of time that we've just, that the authors, that Josh and Sandy and Kevin and other co-authors described in the article, what that really means at the company level.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'll start with a bit about Outset, but I'll probably broaden the aperture. Most of my career, I started at Guidant. That was my 1-2 year period at a big company. And for the rest of my career, I've been entirely at sort of venture stage back and venture back companies. So I think there's a lot of lessons that I've learned over the years, much beyond Outset. But anyway, Outset is focused on developing and delivering the first new technology for dialysis, focused on improving dialysis, both in the acute setting, cost and clinical outcomes, and also at home. So I would say sort of the moral center of the company is really enabling greater access to home dialysis. Our experience on the reimbursement side has been a little bit different because dialysis is really, as I joke, it's really the only truly socialized aspect of our healthcare system. And through congressional legislation in the 1970s, there is Medicare for all, regardless of age, the minute you start dialysis. That has its own structural limitations because it's one bundled rate, which until very, very recently has had no opportunity for any new technology. If you delivered something new, it had to be fit into about a $250 bundled rate per treatment. So we've had a lot of challenges because of that. CMS did establish kind of an NTAP-like program for dialysis recently, but I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole because I think that is not broadly applicable, and I would rather try to say something of utility during our limited time here for more than maybe one company. So let me kind of take a step back. I have had to participate in or directly raise money as a CEO for many startups. And I would say in every case, if I had a magic wand, what I wanted to wish away were reimbursement challenges. I think that some of the, it really boils down to the FDA does give you a prescription or a recipe. You may not like the recipe. You may not like the number of ingredients. You may not like the cooking time. You may burn yourself several times, but it will eventually come out of the oven. And the data and the history supports that. So particularly, I think the reimbursement has been my greatest challenge with investors. And that's what I've heard over and over again from entrepreneurs and CEOs. The very first slide with the feedback really touched on it. I wrote down highly variable and unpredictable. That has unfortunately been my experience over and over again, particularly again, I also chair MDMA. And so on behalf of all of the sort of emerging small and mid-cap companies, it is the variability and the unpredictability that really makes raising money so very challenging. And data like this, unfortunately, 44% receiving Medicare coverage, is probably not going to give investors more confidence, nor will it give more CEOs ammunition in being able to cross the finish line. So that's my biggest concern, actually, is the ability for our industry to continue to acquire the fuel that it needs in the form of capital to get early stage technologies that really will benefit patients across the finish line. And also, I'll maybe share a personal story. I think our ability to attract employees, that we need to get the very best and the brightest into earlier stage companies. Not that the large companies don't deserve them, they do, but they already have a head of steam. They've got the flywheel moving. We need smart people at the earlier stages of the innovation life cycle. And my concern is you go through this experience once, as I did. This happened to be a breast cancer diagnostics. And I was very naive about reimbursement, didn't know anything about it. 3 or 4 years later, I think we spent, this was probably 10 or 12 years ago, roughly $6 million, which was a very sizable portion of the company's capital, and ultimately didn't succeed. And so you could say, fair enough, maybe it was a technology that didn't deserve to win. But again, the uncertainty and the absence of access to the experts who I think have done this over and over again. As a small company, you don't have those resources. I promised myself I would never again work for a startup that had an unknown reimbursement path, and I never again did. So my dual concerns are attracting investment capital and attracting the highest caliber of intellect that we can into the earliest stages of the life cycle. Those are what I think are the big impacts.
Right. There's a lot to unpack there. And I know you touched on a couple of things that were asked in the chat, but I think let me circle back around, because I think you made probably the most relevant point, that you were going to work at a company that didn't at least kind of have like a strategy plan and a way to tackle it. And as we heard, we're emphasizing, the kind of study for the technologies that were included. I would offer that even the ones that were excluded, which didn't necessarily have an NCD, but had like, a code or a piece, or that their path is also still somewhat twisty and windy. It's just that for the sake of like a clean analysis to be able to extract some conclusion from, we left it, or the authors left it such that they, really wanted something that truly needed like some coverage, a novel designation, et cetera. So that I think alludes a little bit to what you're talking about, Leslie. All right, Josh, since you were the senior author on this, I know that this has been, if you will, I think that, and I think you may have even shared with some of the co-authors that by the metrics on the JAMA site, that it's definitely ranking in like some of the top kind of, I would say, clicked on or at least downloaded articles. And it's not surprising, because I think in and of itself, this is the first article of its kind to illustrate some of these tensions, dynamics, this deeper conversation, what is the role of the FDA, what's the role of CMS, et cetera. I think it's something that a lot of folks, just by the sheer numbers of people kind of listening in on this webinar, are deeply interested in. If you don't mind, can you discuss, like, this is just one study in like a long line of research and kind of thoughts around this topic. Can you talk about, if you want to, anything that got you here, like kind of the path to getting to this article, but then maybe even more interesting is like, what's coming next? What can we expect? Because I think a lot of the folks in the chat have been asking questions that want to go deeper into some of this, the small company, big company dynamic. Leslie touched on it. Do you mind just giving us, even if it's aspirational, a preview of like, where will this work go next for Biodesign?
Absolutely. Thanks, Kavita. And thanks to the other panelists and our co-authors on this work. Just to answer the first piece of your question, which is sort of how do we get here? I think that the learnings from my prior engagements around FDA reform did suggest that bringing real data to the conversation helps shape everyone's views, because facts are facts. And if we can establish those, it helps us have a baseline for decision making. And of course, the industry, innovators, investors are complaining about this issue, but it was really important to start documenting really how bad is it. And what we did back in 2022, when we published our first article in this regard, it was a survey. And we saw from that survey that, as Sandy mentioned, that the delays were significant. And more importantly, those delays are infecting innovators. And you heard it right here from Leslie. People are avoiding the space if there isn't a coverage in an area already. And if we care about innovation for patients, if we care about the future of innovation for unsolved problems, many of those unsolved problems are going to be in categories that do not have coverage. And so we need to find a way to facilitate coverage for important breakthrough medical technologies that really have an opportunity to improve outcomes for patients and also reduce cost. So this follow-up was really in response to some of the things that we heard from the first survey. Was, of course, that's everyone's opinion, but what is it really? Because that's just opinions. And I think that was a legitimate criticism of our first paper, and it was a place to start. So we followed it up with this work, now demonstrating factually, based on real evidence, what the actual delay is. And surprisingly, it's worse than the opinions. Opinions were 4.7. This is a median of 5.7. So where do we go from here? I would, for all 130 people listening today, I'd be interested in your views on what would be useful to help illustrate the importance of addressing this, and perhaps what parameters around which they need to be addressed. So we're in a stage right now, having just published this, where we want to get some feedback. I'd love to hear what you have to say about what other important information would be useful in helping shape policy, information that we can provide to the policymakers at CMS, as well as in Congress, to help make the right decisions about the future of TSET and this area in general. My guess is, similar to what we did with FDA reform, is we now need to tie it to real impact for the healthcare system as well as patients. And how do we do that is a formula. We'll have to cross that divide, but I think we're going to try to figure it out within the next couple of weeks, and then begin our next research effort to try to deliver that data, again, to help inform policymakers on how they go forward. But my guess is translating what if there is a delay of actually 5.7 years for median, minimal, nominal coverage, which is really most, I would say most investors and innovators probably look at that nominal coverage definition as insufficient, but it was a place to start. Really, what is the impact on patient care? What is the impact on beneficiary access? And what is the impact on the innovation ecosystem? I think might be sort of the next place to go to demonstrate why this is an important issue that needs to be addressed.
Josh, do you want to just give, because your timeline, one of the reasons I think we wanted to kind of make sure this webinar happened as quickly as it did, obviously the publication came out, but do you want to just highlight some key dates for
Absolutely.
Actually some of the comments? Because I think the very comments you're asking, maybe people and folks may or may not want to, I know there's a webinar etiquette, they may not want to put them in our Q&A, but there is an opportunity to offer comments. And I think many of the ones that are posted would actually be helpful for CMS to hear, and maybe even in a more expanded form. Do you want to just remind some key
Absolutely.
dates for CMS feedback that are
Absolutely.
coming?
There are 4 documents that have been put forward by CMS for review and comment. 3 guidance documents and 1 overarching document with regard to TSET in general, which is as you heard, the transitional coverage for emerging technologies. The 3 guidance document comments are due on the 21st of this month, and the comments for the overall TSET proposal is due on the 28th.
I was just trying to figure out a way, if I can, I'll put the link to kind of offer that guidance. And as any of us who have worked in the government know, Parashar and I know that they do read all the comments. So just in case people who are listening are thinking, yeah, sure, I'll put something in, everything becomes part of what staff review and then also available publicly. So, which I think is a good thing. There's an incredible transparency on that all around. So let me now, so I saved kind of the hardest question for last and I want to ask each panelist, and we'll go we'll go in the order that we started with the questions. So Parashar, you're up. I want to ask each of you to kind of put yourself in the role of the CMS administrator, kind of the person who, unfortunately, in the government, even if you're in charge, so to speak, of Medicare, Medicaid, you're not actually in charge. There's always someone above you that needs to clear things. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that kind of the key final decision rests with you. You're the administrator for CMS, and you really do have to think about a number of other tensions. I just want to put people in a broader context. In 2023, we've also seen a number of really innovative therapeutics. One of the chat questions asked about kind of drugs and biotech. And so that was not part of the purview of this analysis of the JAMA article. But if you are the CMS administrator, that is your purview. So each one of you, you're the administrator. You're thinking about the fact that, and these are facts, that you've got novel drugs that have been approved and that there's already a nod towards coverage of those drugs within certain criteria, and that alone will be estimated to raise Part B premiums. So the amount of money a Medicare beneficiary needs to pay out of pocket. And I'm trying to just be as objective as possible. Something else that maybe people listening don't realize, 2031 is the estimated date for the hospital trust fund Medicare has, based on what monies we're all paying in as workers into the Medicare trust fund. 2031 is when a significant amount of the hospital trust fund runs out in such a manner that it can affect beneficiary access, even just for the hospital services, or what we would call Part A. And then we all probably can collectively think about the kind of pipeline of promising treatments, devices, treatments, and diagnostics, whether it is in cancer or rare disease, it doesn't matter. This is an incredible explosion of science. I didn't even use the 2 most popular letters, AI. So there's a number of things. So Parashar, we'll start with you. You're the CMS administrator, and you're having to think about what to do. You're reading the JAMA article, you're reading all the comments. Kind of just talk through like where your instincts are around coverage and things that you'd like to maybe do as the administrator based on the information we have.
Yeah, thanks, Kavita. So I think the first thing I would ask for are more resources. I mean, I don't have the facts and figures in front of me, but since I was in Medicare and to now, I don't know that the budget has grown sufficiently relative to all the responsibilities that have been added to CMS. And when I say CMS, I also include the max, right? I mean, the 5.7 is, I mean, it's just very poor. Let's just put that out there. But the context is the resources that they have to actually accomplish the job. And I think resources in the coverage space are important precisely because we're all taxpayers. We all want to make sure that beneficiaries have access to the technology that they need that will help them. And with the limited resources that Medicare has as an insurance program in the first place. So I think the first thing I would do is make a case for both extra resources and the right type of resources, right? The type of folks that understand clinical trial design, that understand outcomes measurements, et cetera, to basically work hand in hand with folks in companies that also have those skill sets, that have that experience, so that collaboratively you're actually bringing evidence to the table that'll be useful not only to the program, but for beneficiaries and companies to, in essence, really show what Medicare means. And, you know, to Leslie's analogy of the recipe, that you're in essence baking the right goods for the folks that are going to be eating the
Right.
food that you're making, because if you're making the wrong goods, then that's not good for anybody. And so I think you want to make sure you're setting the table with the right menu, if you will. So I would ask for resources and make sure those resources are there, and not let the lack of resources drive bad policy. You know, one of the things that I noted in their notice is they estimate, 10 companies will come through, and of those we have enough resources, 5. From my perspective, that's not acceptable. If you're lacking the resources, work hand in hand with Congress and others to actually get the resources, get the right type of resources. That would be my number one priority, Kavita. And then make sure you implement the program and make quick changes along the way as you learn from experience.
Yeah, I think that I just want to emphasize, and I used to actually have the numbers in front of me, but I can tell you, at least the coverage group, kind of your alma mater, if you, or at least your colleagues and folks from CMS that you work with, that they're not getting a lot. I think many Americans are shocked at how small that team is. And then when you think about people that have both clinical and regulatory experience, we're talking an N of about, 1 or 2. And so it's not, I think that's a great suggestion, and probably one that we can't emphasize enough and enough and enough. So thank you. Leslie, same thing for you. Feel free to double down on something else or to just inject in. Again, remember, you're trying to make all the key decisions. You're the administrator. What are some of the things that, now reflecting on the evidence that's been shown, some spirit of the comments, changes you'd like to see made, or other suggestions?
Well, I certainly would echo the call for additional resources. That's very, very clear. I think if I were thinking about this as a turnaround, as a CEO, your well-worn tactic, look for some quick wins early on as you're turning around the organization. And I think that's been part of the problem. I think one of the reasons why investors, and I just keep coming back to that, because we need to make sure that the capital flow is directed toward med device versus pharma versus biotech versus other, right? We're all competing for the same dollar. I think investors need to see some quick wins. I'm concerned that, so one thing I would do, I would think very long and hard about modifications to this TSET proposal. I think that the number one concern that the investment community will and does have is that it seems to be limited to about 5 technologies a year, right? And when you look at what's in the paper, the scope of the number of new technologies, and oh, by the way, they have to have qualified for breakthrough, and I think it's breakthrough greater than 12 months away from FDA clearance. I mean, that field is very, very narrow, and you're just sort of creating another occlusion. And so I would think very hard about how do we define parameters, because not every device is deserving, and that's fair. But I don't think 5 is a quick win. I really don't think that's going to make enough of an impact to bring and attract more investment to our space. I also then would think about maybe another category, which is, the devices that are labeled sort of promising, but with limited context, because there are many devices that fit that very well. They have incredible promise for impact on the patient community, but they may not have been received or may not have chosen to go down the breakthrough route. There are very good reasons why startups and devices don't go down the breakthrough pathway. So what about all these technologies that fall into this promising with limited context? And I think that's a real challenge area, because as you all know, that gets deferred. The coverage decisions kind of get deferred to the max. And now, again, as a small company, I don't have a team of 20 reimbursement reps that can go and individually lobby. I don't have chief medical officers for regions of the country that can individually lobby the max. And I think that can be the real valley of death, which I don't see addressed. So I'd say TSET, good start, but probably needs to evolve to produce a quick win. And then I'd really love to see CMS think about where a lot of the really cool technologies live, which is in this promising but limited context, and again, create boundary conditions and guidance clarity around how to get there, instead of having to go to each and every MAC individually, which is very difficult, if not impossible, for most startups to really execute against.
Perfect. And I know there's been some questions already around that kind of, whether it's breakthrough technologies or a path to reimbursement, and really like, what's the hope there? So I know you just briefly touched on that. We'll see. Josh, I'll let you have a little bit of the final word, but then I will try to do a rapid kind of fire to get some of these questions in. You're the
Yeah.
CMS administrator. Anything else you
Yeah.
would change in addition to what others have said?
Yeah, I won't, I mean, I think the comments that have been said already, I won't repeat those. I'll just address, something that often comes up, which is, how much is this going to cost, and is this going to bankrupt Medicare? And, the fact is that these days, and this has been something that innovators have had in mind from the, within the last 10 years, everyone's trying to make something cost effective. And I think most of these technologies have a pretty compelling cost effective argument, such that it should save money. And I think that to the extent that, there's limited resources, I think those technologies that have a pretty good case for saving money probably could be prioritized in this overall framework. And as Leslie said, expanded much greater, because in the long run, this should save money. Many of these technologies are trying to address morbidities and mortality that really does cost the system more. And we want to encourage innovation. I'll address one more thing and then hand it back to you, Kavita, which is the timing of this. In the original concept behind MCIT, the idea was that confidence in coverage would come earlier in the process, which would inspire innovators to go at this and take on challenging things. If they get a breakthrough, they've got access to the program, and they could go raise money around that, and that would bring investors and innovators around very important areas that don't have existing coverage areas. And that was a great inspirational opportunity. We're missing that in the current proposal right now. And that's my opinion. And by having it so late and by having it so narrow, what's the chances that you actually even would get into the program? Is very low. And therefore, it's not likely to have a significant impact in inducing investment and innovators into the space to go after things that really are very important to Medicare beneficiaries.
Perfect. Thank you. I know we only have a couple of minutes, but something that keeps coming up is around what's known as parallel review. Prashar, I'm going to ask you to answer this because it kind of summarizes a little bit of, FDA's mandate is safe and effective, CMS's mandate is reasonable and necessary, and how do those two things kind of live together? But there's also been some comments in the chat around parallel review. Do you see an opportunity, or perhaps putting it a different way, are there ways in which this parallel review process, that if it were actually conducted, and we have some examples of this, that could actually, solve some of these problems?
Well, yes. I mean, look, the parallel review process has a much more tailored, more specific, more narrow eligibility criteria, which is partly why it doesn't get used. I mean, at the end of the day, and from my perspective, the TSET broad steps, principles laid out, early conversation before FDA approval, alignment at least between the company and CMS, and potentially even, definitely between FDA and the company, that ought to happen as early as the three of them can do, whether it's a year, 15 months, et cetera. Probably depends on the nature of the technology. I think if you do that and you get to agreement quickly, I think it'll instill confidence. You'll have clarity. That's the other piece. You're guaranteed, if you're going to undertake this study, we will cover, right? And that, I think, addresses a lot of the concerns I think Leslie legitimately raised. And then once you see that track record, and I agree, 5 is not enough, frankly. Right. And rough back of the envelope estimates, you don't need $100 million. You can probably get by, with less than 10 million a year and have 60 or 70 companies raise their hand, of which 20 to 30 get accepted. You've got a good track record. I think that will instill confidence in folks. I think if you do those, whether you call it parallel review, whether you call it TSET, the initials in the alphabet soup doesn't matter, as long as you're carrying out these steps early enough and you've got clarity that you're going to get coverage. What you call it, from my perspective, matters less, as long as you're considering the broadest, casting the broadest net that makes sense, right? You don't want to have technologies that already have coverage, for example, go through this. So you want to make sure it's sensible. But beyond that, what you call it, frankly, is less important than actually doing it.
That's great. And with that, unfortunately, we're out of time. I know there were a number of other questions. We tried to weave some of this in. Some of you did in your answers, but I want to thank our entire panel. And then we have captured everyone's Q&A. And I think that both in the responses for the actual CMS proposed language, as well as some future webinars, we're going to be sure to tackle some of the themes that you raised, and feel free to reach out to any of, whether it's the study authors or any of the panelists or myself, so that we can help be a point of contact for some of the experts that you heard about. I want to thank everyone for attending. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.